The moment that started this entire experiment happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my kitchen with 2 grocery bags on the counter, staring at a receipt that seemed far too long for the small amount of food I had brought home. There was some chicken, a loaf of bread, a few vegetables, yogurt, cereal, snacks, and several convenient little items that promised to make dinner easier. Yet, somehow, the total had climbed higher than I expected. Again, I looked inside the bags, then back at the receipt, and I honestly wondered where all the money had gone. It felt as though I had paid for a full week of food, but had only brought home enough for a few scattered meals. That was when I thought about my grandmother's kitchen. She raised a family during a time when money was often tight, grocery stores were smaller, and convenience foods were not filling every shelf. Yet I never remember her kitchen feeling empty. There was always soup simmering, bread cooling near the window, beans soaking in a bowl, or something warm coming out of the oven. She could take a few potatoes, an onion, some flour, and a small piece of meat, and somehow turn them into a meal that fed everyone. Nobody called it meal planning, batch cooking, or zero-waste living back then. It was simply how she cooked. I began asking myself a question that I could not ignore. What would happen if I stopped cooking like a modern shopper and started cooking the way my grandmother did? Not for one meal, not for one weekend, but for 30 full days. Could I actually lower my grocery bill? Could I waste less food? Could I make satisfying meals without relying on boxes, frozen dinners, expensive snacks, and takeout? And most importantly, would this old-fashioned way of cooking fit into a modern life? I decided to turn the idea into a real challenge. For the next 30 days, I would cook at home using simple ingredients. I would plan meals around what I already had. I would use leftovers instead of forgetting them in the refrigerator. And I would track every dollar I spent. I was not going to pretend that I lived in the 1950s. I still had a refrigerator, a freezer, a slow cooker, and a busy schedule, but I wanted to follow the basic rules that guided my grandmother's kitchen. Buy ingredients instead of products, cook once and eat more than once, never waste something that could become another meal, and make do before buying more. Before the challenge began, I looked at my normal spending. When I added groceries, takeout, coffee, quick lunches, and those small emergency trips to the store, the total was uncomfortable. I was spending far more than I realized because the money disappeared in pieces. $20 here, $40 there, a few snacks, a prepared meal, a sauce I used once, vegetables I forgot to cook. None of those purchases seemed serious by themselves, but together they were quietly draining my budget. So I gave myself a clear goal. I wanted to reduce my food spending by at least 25%. I also wanted to finish the month with less food waste and fewer last-minute takeout orders. I wrote down the rules on a piece of paper and taped it inside a cabinet door. Shop from the pantry first, plan before going to the store, cook simple meals, use every leftover, freeze what cannot be eaten in time, and never buy something just because it looks convenient. The first few days were harder than I expected, not because I could not cook, but because I had become used to buying solutions. Breakfast came from a box, lunch came in a package, dinner came with instructions printed on the back. I had confused convenience with necessity, and suddenly I had to think differently. Instead of asking what I felt like eating, I had to ask what needed to be used. Instead of buying ingredients for one specific recipe, I had to choose foods that could become several meals. By the end of the first week, something surprising had already started to happen. My kitchen felt calmer. My refrigerator looked more organized, and I was beginning to understand why my grandmother rarely seemed worried about what to cook. She did not begin with a recipe. She began with what she had, and as I prepared to rebuild my pantry around that same idea, I realized that this challenge was not only about saving money, it was about learning how to see food differently. The next step was rebuilding my pantry, because when I looked closely at the shelves, I realized they were full but not truly useful. I had half-empty bags of specialty flour, sauces purchased for one recipe, snack boxes, flavored mixes, and several jars I barely remembered buying. There was plenty of food, yet somehow I still felt as though there was nothing to cook. My grandmother's pantry had been the opposite. It never looked fancy, but nearly everything inside could be used in several different ways. I started by taking everything out and placing it on the kitchen table. Once the shelves were empty, I could finally see how much money had been sitting there, unused. There were duplicate spices, expired baking mixes, canned foods hidden behind larger boxes, and ingredients I had forgotten completely. I found 3 open bags of rice, 4 cans of beans, 2 jars of pasta sauce, oats, flour, lentils, and enough tea to last for months before buying anything new. I made a written inventory of what I already had. Then I tried to remember the foods my grandmother always kept nearby. Her kitchen was built around simple staples: flour, oats, rice, dried beans, potatoes, onions, eggs, milk, butter, canned tomatoes, seasonal vegetables, and small amounts of meat. These ingredients were not exciting on their own, but together they could become soups, stews, biscuits, casseroles, pancakes, sandwiches, pies, and dozens of other meals. Nothing had only one purpose. That became my new pantry rule. Every ingredient had to earn its space. If I bought something, I wanted to know at least 2 or 3 ways I could use it. A bag of oats could become breakfast, cookies, or a topping for baked fruit. Potatoes could become soup, roasted vegetables, breakfast hash, or a side dish. Eggs could be breakfast, lunch, dinner, or baking ingredients. Even a whole chicken could provide several meals instead of only one dinner. When I went grocery shopping for the first time during the challenge, the cart looked very different. There were fewer boxes and more basic ingredients. I bought a large bag of rice instead of several microwave packets, dried beans instead of expensive prepared side dishes, a whole chicken instead of boneless portions, plain yogurt instead of individual flavored cups, and seasonal vegetables instead of pre-cut trays. I also bought flour, yeast, eggs, oats, potatoes, onions, carrots, and canned tomatoes. At first, the cart looked almost too simple. I worried that the meals would feel boring, but then I remembered that my grandmother's food never felt boring. She changed meals through seasoning, texture, and careful use of leftovers. The same basic ingredients could taste completely different from one day to the next. Potatoes cooked with onions and eggs felt different from potatoes added to soup, and chicken roasted with herbs felt different from chicken mixed into a casserole. I also noticed how many temptations were built into the grocery store. Products promising to save 10 minutes often cost 2 or 3 times as much as their basic ingredients. Pre-cut vegetables, seasoned rice packets, bottled sauces, frozen breakfast sandwiches, and individually wrapped snacks all looked convenient. But when I compared prices carefully, I realized I was paying extra for small amounts of preparation and a great deal of packaging. The hardest section was the snack aisle. I was used to placing several items in the cart without much thought: crackers, granola bars, cookies, and small bags of chips. This time I stopped and asked whether I could make something similar with what I already had. Popcorn kernels were cheaper than packaged snacks. Oats could become homemade bars. Bread could become toast, and fruit could replace some of the sweet treats I usually bought. I did not eliminate every convenience food, but I stopped treating them as necessities. When I reached the checkout, I expected the total to be lower, but I was still surprised. I had spent significantly less than during my normal weekly trip, even though I had purchased enough ingredients for breakfast, lunches, dinners, snacks, and baking. The cart contained more actual food and fewer expensive shortcuts. I saved nearly $40 on that first trip alone. Back at home, I poured the staples into clear containers, placed older food at the front, and grouped similar ingredients together. For the first time in months, I could see exactly what I owned. The pantry looked plain, almost old-fashioned, but it also looked dependable. There were no instant meals waiting to rescue me. Yet there were ingredients that could become almost anything. Standing in front of those shelves, I began to understand one of my grandmother's quietest lessons. A useful pantry does not need to be filled with endless choices. It only needs foods that work hard. And now that I had the right ingredients, the next challenge was learning how to cook them without spending every hour of the day in the kitchen. The part I had been most worried about was time, because whenever people talk about cooking the old-fashioned way, it can sound as though you need to spend the entire day standing over a stove, kneading dough, peeling vegetables, and washing endless dishes. I had a normal schedule, responsibilities, and days when I was tired before dinner even began. So if this challenge required several hours of cooking every day, I knew I would not last 30 days. But as I thought more carefully about my grandmother's kitchen, I realized she did not cook every meal from the beginning. She created routines that allowed one day's work to make the next several days easier. On the first Sunday of the challenge, I decided to prepare a few basic foods in advance. I cooked a large pot of beans, made a pan of rice, roasted a tray of carrots, onions, and potatoes, baked a simple loaf of bread, and placed a whole chicken in the oven. None of these foods was complicated, and most of the cooking time did not require me to stand nearby. While the chicken roasted and the beans simmered, I cleaned the kitchen, answered messages, folded laundry, and prepared vegetables for the week. By the end of the afternoon, my refrigerator looked completely different. Instead of random ingredients and half-used packages, I had containers of food that could be turned into several meals. The rice could become a side dish, fried rice, soup, or a filling for stuffed vegetables. The beans could become chili, a simple lunch bowl, soup, or mashed bean spread. The roasted vegetables could be served with dinner, added to eggs, or blended into soup, and the chicken would become far more than one meal. That evening, we ate roasted chicken with potatoes, carrots, and homemade bread. The next day, I sliced some of the chicken for sandwiches. On Tuesday, I added small pieces to a rice and vegetable skillet. On Wednesday, I used the remaining meat in a casserole. And finally, I simmered the bones with onion ends, carrot peels, herbs, and water to make broth. One chicken had helped create 4 different meals and a pot of stock. Before this challenge, I would often buy boneless chicken portions, use them once, and throw away the packaging without thinking about how much more value a whole chicken could provide. Breakfast also became much simpler. I had been buying cereal, frozen waffles, flavored oatmeal packets, and bakery muffins because they seemed fast. But my grandmother's breakfasts were usually made from a few inexpensive staples. I began cooking a pot of plain oatmeal and changing the flavor with apples, cinnamon, raisins, or a spoonful of jam. On other mornings, I ate eggs with toast, leftover potatoes with onions, or homemade biscuits with fruit. These meals cost much less than the individually packaged foods I had been buying, and they kept me full longer. I also made snacks differently. Instead of opening a box every time I felt hungry, I popped kernels on the stove, sliced apples, made toast with peanut butter, baked a small batch of oat cookies, or ate plain yogurt with fruit. None of these snacks was impressive, but they were inexpensive, filling, and already available. I noticed that when food required a small amount of preparation, I ate more intentionally instead of reaching for something simply because it was easy to open. Of course, not everything went perfectly. My first loaf of bread was so dense that it could have been used as a doorstop. I burned 1 pan of biscuits because I became distracted, and I made far too many beans during the first week. But instead of seeing those mistakes as proof that old-fashioned cooking was too difficult, I treated them as part of learning. I sliced the dense bread thin and toasted it. I scraped the burned bottoms from the biscuits, and I froze the extra beans in small portions for future meals. After several days, I began to see a pattern. The more basic food I prepared in advance, the less time I spent making decisions. Dinner no longer began with me staring into the refrigerator at 6 o'clock, wondering what to cook. I already had a starting point, perhaps cooked rice, roasted vegetables, broth, bread, or leftover meat, all I had to do was combine them in a new way. This was how my grandmother saved time, not by avoiding cooking, but by making each cooking session count. She understood that a pot of soup could become lunch for 2 days, that bread could serve breakfast and dinner, and that one oven could cook several things at once. By the middle of the second week, cooking from scratch no longer felt like a daily burden. It felt like a system, and the greatest surprise was that yesterday's work was quietly preparing tomorrow's meal. By the middle of the challenge, I had solved one problem. I knew how to keep basic food ready. But another problem was waiting inside my refrigerator, leftovers. Before these 30 days, I often saved food with good intentions. I would place a small portion of rice in a container, wrap half an onion, store a few roasted vegetables, or push the last piece of chicken onto a crowded shelf. Then several days later, I would find it forgotten, dried out, or no longer safe to eat. I told myself that wasting a little food was normal. But when I began paying attention, I realized those small amounts added up to several complete meals every week. My grandmother never looked at leftovers as old food. She looked at them as the beginning of the next meal. A spoonful of vegetables could go into soup. A small piece of meat could flavor a pot of beans. Stale bread could become breadcrumbs. And cooked potatoes could be fried with onions for breakfast. Nothing needed to look exactly the same. When it appeared on the table again, the secret was transformation. I created a simple leftover shelf in the refrigerator. Everything that needed to be eaten soon went in one visible place. No containers were allowed to disappear behind milk cartons or jars. I also placed a small piece of paper on the refrigerator door and wrote down what was waiting inside: cooked rice, half a bowl of beans, roasted carrots, 2 slices of chicken, and 3 baked potatoes. It sounded almost too simple, but seeing the list stopped me from forgetting what I had. Once a week, I planned a use-it-up dinner. There was no recipe and no shopping list. I simply opened the refrigerator and worked with whatever needed attention. One evening, I found a small amount of chicken, cooked rice, half an onion, a few soft carrots, and the last spoonful of peas. Before the challenge, none of those items would have looked like a proper dinner, but I cooked them together in a skillet with a little butter, garlic, and seasoning, then added an egg. Within 20 minutes, I had enough fried rice for 2 people. The entire meal was made from food that might otherwise have been thrown away. Another day, leftover mashed potatoes became small potato cakes. I mixed them with an egg, a little flour, chopped onion, salt, and pepper, then cooked them until golden. Stale bread became crumbs for a casserole. Overripe apples became a simple baked dessert. And vegetables that were beginning to soften went into soup. Every time I rescued something, I felt as though I had found money hiding in the refrigerator. I also began freezing smaller portions sooner. Instead of waiting until I was tired of eating the same meal, I placed 1 or 2 servings in the freezer on the first day. This gave me easy lunches later and prevented food from sitting too long. I froze beans, soup, broth, bread, cooked chicken, and even small portions of rice. These became my new convenience foods, except I had made them myself and already paid for them. One of my favorite changes was making broth from scraps. I kept a container in the freezer for onion ends, carrot peels, celery leaves, herb stems, and chicken bones. When it was full, I covered everything with water and let it simmer. The result was a rich broth that could become soup, gravy, rice, or sauce. Before this experiment, I had been buying broth in cartons while throwing away the ingredients needed to make it. I also started serving smaller portions because my grandmother believed people could always take more, but food already placed on a plate was often wasted. This small change reduced the amount scraped into the trash after dinner. Leftovers stayed clean and useful, and everyone could still eat as much as they needed. At the end of the 3rd week, I estimated that I had saved at least $25 simply by using food I would normally have discarded. That did not include the meals I avoided buying. Because something was waiting in the freezer, the number surprised me. But the emotional change mattered even more. I no longer saw frugality as making do with something disappointing. I saw it as respecting the money, time, and effort already invested in the food. My grandmother's kitchen was not careful because she was afraid of running out. It was careful because she understood value. By learning to use leftovers the way she did, I discovered that some of the most satisfying meals were not planned in advance. They were created from what was almost forgotten. And by the end of that week, the trash can was lighter, the grocery bill was lower, and I had begun to understand that saving money often starts with using what we already have. By the fourth week, I realized that the greatest savings were not coming from any single recipe. They were coming from the habits behind the recipes. My grandmother did not need a complicated system. She simply repeated a few practical rules until they became part of everyday life. She checked what she had before buying more, planned meals around ingredients that needed to be used, cooked enough to create leftovers, and avoided turning every craving into a shopping trip. The food was important, but the routine was what protected her budget. The first habit I decided to keep was shopping from the pantry before shopping from the store. At the beginning of each week, I opened the cupboards, refrigerator, and freezer and wrote down what was already available. Then I planned meals around those ingredients. If I had rice, beans, canned tomatoes, and onions, I could make soup, chili, or a simple rice bowl if there were eggs, potatoes, and leftover vegetables. Breakfast for dinner was an easy option. This small change stopped me from buying duplicates and helped older ingredients move to the front of the line. I also stopped choosing 7 completely different dinners every week. Modern meal planning often encourages us to buy a long list of special ingredients, use each one once, and then forget the leftovers. My grandmother built meals around repetition. A chicken might appear in several dishes. One pot of beans could become soup, a side dish, and a filling. The same vegetables could be roasted one night and added to eggs the next morning. Instead of feeling boring, this created a rhythm that made cooking easier. Another habit was using meat as part of the meal instead of making it the entire meal. I had been buying large portions of meat because I believed dinner needed a separate piece for every person. My grandmother often stretched smaller amounts through soups, casseroles, pies, beans, rice, and vegetables. I began adding chicken to a pot of soup rather than serving a full chicken breast to everyone. I used a small amount of ground meat in a sauce filled with tomatoes, onions, and lentils, and I served eggs, beans, or potatoes as the main part of some meals. The plate still felt filling, but the cost was much lower. Breakfast and lunch became more predictable too. I used to believe variety meant buying many different products: cereal, yogurt cups, frozen sandwiches, snack bars, and prepared lunches. During the challenge, I repeated simple meals: oatmeal with fruit, eggs and toast, soup with bread, leftovers, or a sandwich made from roasted chicken. This reduced decision fatigue and made it easier to use what I had. I did not wake up every morning asking what sounded exciting. I already knew there was something affordable and satisfying waiting. Shopping less often made a bigger difference than I expected. Before the challenge, I went to the store several times a week, sometimes for one missing ingredient, but I almost always returned with 5 additional things. During these 30 days, I tried to shop once a week and make substitutions when something was missing. If a recipe called for spinach but I had cabbage, I used cabbage. If I ran out of a certain spice, I chose another one. Not every meal needed to follow exact instructions. Every avoided emergency trip protected the budget from impulse purchases. My grandmother also used simple systems that cost nothing. She kept a handwritten list of freezer contents, stored leftovers in visible containers, saved jars for dry goods, measured portions carefully, and planned one flexible meal each week for food that needed to be used. I copied those habits, and the kitchen began to feel less chaotic. I knew what was available, what needed to be cooked, and what could wait. There were unexpected benefits beyond money. I was eating fewer heavily processed foods, my meals felt more satisfying, and I no longer spent so much time deciding whether to cook or order takeout. Cooking became less stressful because the decisions had already been made. I also noticed that I appreciated food more when I had prepared it myself. A bowl of soup made from homemade broth and leftover vegetables felt far more valuable than something quickly removed from a package. Still, there was one difficult evening when I nearly abandoned the entire challenge. I had been busy all day. I was tired, and the thought of cooking felt impossible. I picked up my phone and started looking at takeout options. Then I remembered the containers in the freezer. I reheated a portion of chicken stew, toasted 2 slices of homemade bread, and dinner was ready in less time than delivery would have taken. That meal reminded me why preparation mattered. The freezer had become my grandmother's version of fast food. By the end of the 4th week, I understood that saving money in the kitchen did not require perfect cooking, endless discipline, or complicated recipes. It required a few dependable habits, repeated again and again. Plan with what you have. Cook ingredients that can serve more than one purpose. Waste as little as possible, and prepare for the days when energy is low. The recipes helped me complete the challenge. But these quiet habits were the reason the savings continued to grow. On the final day of the challenge, I sat down at the kitchen table with every grocery receipt, takeout receipt, and handwritten note from the past 30 days. I added the numbers twice because I wanted the result to be honest, not dramatic. Before the experiment, my average monthly food spending was about $780 when I included groceries, quick lunches, coffee, snacks, takeout, and those small trips to the store that never felt important at the time. During the 30 days of cooking like my grandmother, I spent $486, which meant I had saved $294 in 1 month. The grocery savings were only one part of the total. I spent less on packaged snacks, breakfast products, bottled sauces, frozen dinners, and pre-cut ingredients. But the largest difference came from takeout. Before the challenge, tired evenings often became expensive evenings. One delivery order could easily cost $40 or $50 after fees and tips. During the entire month, I ordered food only once, and even then, I chose a small meal instead of turning it into a full family order. I also saved money by wasting less. I had started the month with a refrigerator full of forgotten containers and vegetables that often spoiled before I used them. By the final week, almost everything had a purpose. Leftovers became lunches, soft vegetables became soup, bread ends became crumbs, chicken bones became broth, and extra meals went into the freezer before I grew tired of them. I estimated that reducing food waste had saved at least $75, but it may have been even more. The most surprising part was that the kitchen was not empty at the end of the month. There were still several portions of soup, beans, bread, and cooked chicken in the freezer. The pantry still held rice, flour, oats, canned tomatoes, lentils, potatoes, and onions. So the challenge had not ended with me using every last ingredient. Some of the money I had spent would continue feeding us into the following month. That made the savings feel even more meaningful. Not everything worked perfectly. I learned that making every single item from scratch was not realistic for me. Homemade bread was satisfying, but there were weeks when buying a simple loaf made more sense. I also discovered that some convenience foods truly did save enough time to be worth the cost. Frozen vegetables, canned beans, and basic pasta sauce were still useful when chosen carefully. My grandmother's wisdom was not about rejecting everything modern. It was about knowing which conveniences helped and which ones quietly drained the budget. I also stopped romanticizing the past. My grandmother cooked this way because she had to, not because every day in the kitchen was peaceful and beautiful. Cooking took effort. Planning required discipline, and some meals were very simple. But that simplicity was also what made the system dependable. She did not need 30 different dinner options. She needed enough food, prepared carefully, with as little waste as possible. There were 5 habits I knew I wanted to continue. Checking the pantry before writing a shopping list, planning meals around what needed to be used, preparing a few basic ingredients each week, freezing extra portions immediately, and having one use-it-up meal before buying more food. I would also continue using less meat, repeating simple breakfasts, and keeping inexpensive staples available for difficult days. The challenge changed more than my grocery bill. I felt calmer around food. I no longer believed that every meal needed to be new, exciting, or perfectly planned. I became more confident making substitutions, more creative with leftovers, and less dependent on expensive products to solve ordinary problems. I had started the month hoping to save money, but I ended it feeling more capable. My grandmother never gave me a written financial plan. She taught through small actions, scraping every bit of dough from a bowl, saving half an onion, turning bones into broth, and serving yesterday's potatoes in a completely new way. Those actions seemed ordinary when I was younger. But now I understood that they were a form of wisdom. She knew that money was not only saved at the store, it was saved in the kitchen, one meal, one leftover, and one careful decision at a time. So, was cooking like my grandmother for 30 days worth it? Absolutely. I saved nearly $300, reduced food waste, avoided countless impulse purchases, and rebuilt habits that I had forgotten. I will not make everything from scratch forever, and I will still enjoy takeout occasionally. But I will never look at my pantry, my grocery cart, or my leftovers in quite the same way again. If you decided to try this challenge, you would not need to begin with 30 days. Start with 1 week. Choose a few simple meals, use what you already have, and write down every dollar you avoid spending. You may be surprised by how quickly the savings grow, and I would love to know, what kitchen habit did your mother or grandmother teach you that still saves money today? Share it in the comments, and if you enjoy practical lessons about simple living, thoughtful spending, and old-fashioned wisdom, subscribe and join me for the next challenge.